Last time, I only managed to get through about 6 of your questions. Since then, there have been about a dozen more. At this rate, I'll never get through all this, but I'm going to do my best. We'll see if we can answer a few more questions today. But if you like this style of video, if you want to do the Q&As, I'll just keep doing them till I run out of questions to answer. Dave asks, I thought I'd seen people do it before, but they never explain. Can you forge weld in the coal forge without using flux? Just get the metal hot enough? Well, more or less, yes. Flux isn't some sort of magic powder. It's not glue. It does not make materials stick together. It just kind of helps with some of the issues around forge welding. Mostly what it does is clean the material. It melts, it coats the material, and it kind of eats off some of the scale that may be on there. It then also binds with the dirt, the scale, and any other impurities are on the surface of the weld. And when you strike that very first hammer blow, that splatter you see, that's not sparks from the material, that's all that molten flux and scale and other crud being expelled out of the weld. So flux really does help, but it is not absolutely necessary. Now, it's not just a matter of more heat, it's a matter of properly prepared weld joints. A proper scarf comes together in the middle and pushes out all the impurities off to the sides. It's also being in a neutral fire, one that gets all of the heat but burns up all of the available oxygen so that you're not adding more scale to the piece while it's in the fire. I've seen a lot of UK smiths that simply don't weld mild steel or wrought iron using any kind of flux. If they're going to be welding tool steel to mild steel or tool steel to wrought iron, they do typically use flux. And in a gas forge, I think they mostly use flux. But flux is not absolutely necessary, and it would be a good test of your forge welding skills to try welding without flux. Improbable Iron asks, how much of a radius do you suggest putting on new power hammer dies? Any tool in a blacksmith shop that isn't meant to be a cutting tool or needs a sharp corner should have the edges radius. That just helps prevent chipping. It also helps prevent introducing little stress risers and places that can turn into cold shuts. My front dies are probably about an 1/8 inch radius, so that's the same as a 1/4 inch diameter round bar. And the ends of the dies are about half of that. So the ends of the dies are a little bit more square, can get a little bit sharper shoulder on something if you're trying to do a tenon, something like that. And the fronts are soft enough that I can work at drawing out even under flat dies. It really is kind of a personal choice. I would start by just radiusing them a little bit and then seeing if you need to do a little bit more. You can always take more off. It's hard to add more. And in the long run, you might find that you need multiple sets of dies for special purposes. Although my big flat dies, I don't see any reason to have different big flat dies, but I do have combo dies and drawing dies depending on what job I'm working on. What is a good outdoor lacquer finish that preserves the shine of wire-wheeled metal but prevents rusting? I really have not done much with lacquer finishes of any kind. I generally use paste wax. That is okay outside up to a point, but it does not last a long time, especially if you've got high UV light, and you would need to reapply paste wax oil, anything like that. But it's worthwhile experimenting with various clear finishes if that's what you're trying to apply. I have used clear powder coat in the past, and you just have to make sure the powder coater knows you don't want the piece sandblasted before they powder coat it. So if there's any scale left on it or anything like that, that's still going to be there. And the piece I did like that was probably 15 years ago, and it still doesn't have any rust on it. So the clear powder coat has held up very well, even without it having been sandblasted beforehand. Yugadruff, I don't know how to pronounce that. So anyways, the question is, will you ever do metal casting? Blacksmithing and casting are two different disciplines. They require two different tooling setups. There are a lot of people out there who dabble in both of those things and do a little bit of casting, a little bit of forging, a little bit of machining, a little bit of welding. It's all fair game, and you can use all that to work on whatever it is you want to work on. But I prefer mostly blacksmithing, so I really don't do any metal casting. Did a little bit in high school. That was almost 60 years ago that I was in high school and doing a little bit of aluminum casting. Since then, the only thing that I've cast would be a pewter bolster on a knife. And in that case, it's actually a lead-free pewter. It's not regular leaded pewter. And if we do more knives as we go forward in this channel, maybe I'll look at casting a little pewter bolster. but I'm not going to be casting big metal items. Certainly not doing cast iron of any form, because that really does require specialized setup that I don't want to invest in, nor do I want to take my time to learn how to do that. But there's nothing wrong with it if you want to get into casting. Elsinore Valley Forge would like to know what I think about the Kanca vise. It's a brand new made post vise I put in the shop. Oh, it's been close to a year now, maybe not quite that long. So far, I've been pretty happy with the vise. I don't really have any complaints. My concerns on it are that it is a lighter duty vise for the size. It's a 5-inch vise, but it probably weighs half of what my old 5-inch vise weighed. And it has rubber ends, on the handle instead of metal ends that eventually are going to fall off, and I'm going to have to machine it down, thread them, and screw something on there, which really shouldn't be a big deal, so I don't think that's a deal breaker on using a vise like that. It's just a little bit lighter. But because it's brand new, and it's probably made out of better materials than a lot of the old wrought iron vises were, I think it's going to hold up fine. It holds better, the jaws are parallel, it doesn't slip anywhere near as bad, although it does still slip some. A leg vise will never hold as well as a good bench vise does. But you don't want to pound too hard on a bench vise unless it's just really a big beast. You could probably get away with it. But a leg vise is meant for forging. This vise is meant for doing other stuff. Dom Mini asks, how much more hardness does a brine quench provide versus plain water? Asking in regards to flint strikers. Well, brine, or really strong salt water, you mix as much salt as you can get to dissolve in the water, is a much faster quench than plain water. Some steels are going to fail if you quench them in brine because it is so harsh that they will end up cracking. So you kind of need to know what you work with. Although in the past, I have successfully quenched W1 strikers in brine. W1 is meant to quench in plain water, but I like my strikers really hard so that they produce a good shower of sparks. Depending on the steel you're using, you might get different results based on the steel. But I had good luck in brine. It also made them more brittle. They were easier to break, so I ended up guaranteeing the strikers just in case somebody had one that broke. But it did produce good results. How much harder? I can't really say. I don't have a hardness tester, and I was more concerned with the sparking capabilities than I was with what the Rockwell hardness was. You would have to do some tests to really find that out. I do have a set of hardness testing files now that I didn't have when I was doing that. And I suppose if I were going to go back to doing that, maybe I would test them with those testing files. But the functionality of the end piece is more important than a number on a scale somewhere. As long as you get the results you want, that's what you're after. But if you're making things like knives and axes, I wouldn't start quenching steels in an inappropriate medium, like taking oil hardening steel and quenching it in water, or water hardening steel and quenching it in brine, unless you really do some research and really test that theory out. And by research, I mean physically making sample pieces, testing them quenched at different temperatures and different mediums, and then stress test those pieces to figure out what your results were. So brine is a faster quench. Super quench, which is brine with some blue dawn and a surfactant, is an even faster quench, way too fast for any kind of tool steel. It will actually harden mild steel to a hardness that's suitable for swedges and fullers and power hammer dies, things like that. Probably not hard enough to make a knife or an axe out of, although it would be better than the mild steel by itself. Shaggy Yeti, I love that username, asks, when will a new blacksmith need to acquire a bigger anvil? Let's say from an 88-pound anvil to something like 100 or 120 pounds. Well, let me start by saying 100 to 120, maybe 150 is probably all the anvil most people will ever need. My anvil is 460 pounds. I like the bigger anvil. It's big, it's solid. I can stage tools on it while I'm working at another part of the anvil and they're not in my way. And I just really like that big anvil, but it isn't necessary. The 100 to 150 pound range is a good general purpose anvil. Most people will be perfectly happy with that. When do you need to go up? If you're starting with a small anvil, when do you need to go up? It really is your work. When you start running into a wall and you say, I just can't get this done as efficiently as I would like because my anvil's jumping around, or I'm starting to work with a striker and I don't want somebody swinging a 10-pound sledgehammer at my 88-pound anvil. Typically the formula is 1/10 the weight of the anvil is the biggest hammer. So if you've got a 10-pound hammer, you should have a 100-pound anvil. If you've got a 14-pound hammer, you should have at least a 140-pound anvil. So if you're starting to work with a striker, that might be a good time to upgrade your anvil. If you're just doing bigger pieces that need a little bit more surface to straighten them, or you need a wider surface to work on, that's a good reason. If your anvil jumps and bounces a little bit more, that'll help. But in the end, most people are going to upgrade their anvil just because they feel like upgrading their anvil. And there's nothing wrong with upgrading and improving and investing in your equipment, because it does pay off in the long run, even if it isn't absolutely necessary. Christopher Coleman asks, hey John, I finally got my shop set enough to do some work. I'm hoping to be able to host a club event within the next year or so. I'm wondering what it takes to pique your interest in demonstrating for our club. Of course, you would be compensated for your time. I'm just curious what the criteria is that you look for when deciding whether to take on the task or passing it up. Well, mostly these days, I pass up going places to demonstrate. I've done that a few times. In fact, I'm going to do it again this summer. I agreed to go out and demonstrate in May for the Northwest Blacksmithing Association. And agreeing to do that when I've turned down so many others over the last few years has more to do with the fact that we really like traveling to the Pacific Northwest, and that we have family within about an hour of where the conference is going to be held. So there's other reasons we would like to go to that part of the country and attend that conference. Mostly though, I am so busy in the shop trying to get the videos out, trying to get time to work on the things I want to work on. There are so many things that need to be done around our property. We try not to get away too much in the summer because of the fire risk. We like to be here if there's a fire in the area so we can do any last minute fire mitigation work, or at least be able to pack up our pets and evacuate the area while a fire comes through. So I really don't tend to go and demonstrate other places. Another reason I don't tend to do that is because as I get older, I wear out a lot faster. I spend a lot more time taking breaks in my day. And somebody that wants to sit and watch a 3 or 4 hour demonstration really wants to watch the demonstration for 3 or 4 hours. They don't want to watch me work for 15 or 20 minutes, take a break, work for another 15 or 20 minutes, take another break. So generally my response to demonstrate is probably going to be a thank you, but no thank you, except for the Rocky Mountain Smiths. I'm also going to do a demo for the Rocky Mountain Smiths, but that'll be a one-day event here in my shop later in the year. And if you're a Rocky Mountain Smiths member, you'll get notice of that. Let's answer one more, and then I think we did more this time than we did the last time. Jacob Peterson says, morning, John. Been a few years now. I just got into blacksmithing and I really want to make hammer making my specialty. Is it worth the hassle? Do they sell, or are they more of a custom asked for thing? There are absolutely people out there who specialize in making hammers. Brent Bailey is one who, I think that's most of his business these days, is making hammers for other blacksmiths. Timothy Dick and Ethan Hardy made a run of hammers, and I suspect they'll probably do something like that again, and I'm sure they sold out of all those hammers. Aaron Sergel Forge, used to make some fantastic hammers. He would make them one at a time. They were really special hammers. They weren't just an ordinary everyday hammer. Put them on Instagram, say this is for sale, and I don't think I ever saw one of those that didn't sell. And they sold for pretty high prices. Custom-made hammers are not a cheap item. If people are looking for cheap hammers, you need to buy a factory-made hammer. If you're looking to buy a hammer custom-made by another blacksmith, you need to be willing to pay a fair price for that. So if you can tool up and become efficient at it, it's probably worth doing. You can probably make a fair income at it. But be aware that it's probably going to take you a long time both to tool up and to become efficient at it, because it's really easy to screw up a hammer by getting the eye just a little crooked or a little off center or something like that, and you have to start over. So there'll be a lot more learning from your mistakes trying to go into business making hammers than there would be making hooks or something like that. If you enjoy these question and answer videos, let me know down in the comments section. If enough people really enjoy them, I'll keep doing them at least until I get through all of this. But I'm thinking this is going to be about 10 weeks worth of question and answer videos. And then I'm still going to try and get other videos done for the Sunday videos. We'll keep doing these on Wednesday as long as I can keep it up. In the meantime, I hope you have time in your day to get out to your shop, make something, stay safe, wear your safety glasses. We'll see you for the next video.